So we're going to continue with our discussion of sampling by looking at how to sample, the actual steps involved. And this is just an overview to give you a feel for the process, because some of the issues we're going to look at shortly require kind of that you have this mental picture of what's involved in sampling. So the first thing is to define a population of interest. And we mentioned that already, that in some ways influences the generalizability of the study. But say we're interested in studying nonprofit organizations in the United States, we need to define what we mean by nonprofit organizations. Do we mean only charitable nonprofits or other kinds of nonprofits? Do we mean only formally incorporated organizations, or to clubs and associations that are not incorporated accounts? So there are clear definitional issues that are involved in specifying the population of interest. Then once we've done that, then we need to identify a sampling frame, because populations exist, but there aren't necessarily clear records, or there's not necessarily clear documentation that allows us to select and contact those organizations. So we need a frame, what's called a sampling frame. It's really the operational definition of the population. And so, again, thinking about nonprofit organizations, the federal government collects a tax form called the Form 990 from most nonprofits, and that those records are available. So maybe that would be a sampling frame that we could use. Then once we have our sampling frame, then we need to select the units, usually using random sampling, but maybe some other kinds of non-probability sampling. But we select units, a subset of units, from the frame to be in our sample. Okay, but just because we select them doesn't mean they end up in the study, because of the ethics of modern research, we need to contact people, inform them about the study, and then they need to participate voluntarily. We need to request their voluntary participation, and that means some people may or may not choose to be in the study. So not everybody selected and ends up in the sample, because of the need to sort of reach them and then inform them and get their participation. And then those who do participate, we need to then record their responses and make observations. We do some analysis. We gather our data. And then finally, we summarize our findings and then draw conclusions about the population. Okay, so with that overview of the sampling steps, sampling process in mind, let's look at some issues that come up in sampling, beginning with what's called coverage bias. So I mentioned that there's a need in most cases for a sampling frame, a list, a map, an organization that represents a population, and that sampling frame may or may not cover the whole population. And that's called a coverage bias, when the frame does not quite cover the population adequately. So let's, going back to our example of nonprofit organizations, I mentioned the IRS Form 990 records as a possible frame for that population. Well, it turns out that not every nonprofit organization is required to submit that form. Only if they have a sufficient amount of revenue or budget do they need to submit that form. So the 990 forms leave out a lot of small nonprofit organizations, and some nonprofit organizations are not even legally incorporated, and they're clubs or neighborhood associations that don't have formal corporate status in their state. They don't file for tax exemption. So we would, if we use the 990 data as our sampling frame, there would be a kind of bias there. We'd be focusing more on larger, more established nonprofit organizations that have at least a minimum sort of operating budget. So the issue of leaving out small organizations would be a possible coverage bias issue. That's when the sampling frame is systematically different, maybe from the target population that we're interested in. And then, if you remember, we select people to be in the sample, and then we have to contact them and solicit their cooperation. So that leads to a second issue, important issue, increasingly these days in many research studies, which is the problem of non-response and the potential bias that comes from non-response. So non-response means that it really comes from two components. We need to contact people. So there's something called a contact rate. What percentage of people do we actually get a hold of, and then a cooperation rate. So again, if we're thinking about our this slide as well as the book gives the example of a telephone survey, but going back to the nonprofit example, we would need to contact the nonprofit organizations, and we may be successful reaching some, but not necessarily others. We may have trouble contacting some of the organizations. So we may only, let's say, get through to 50% of the organizations that we end up sampling. In other words, we select maybe 100 organizations, but we may only successfully contact 50 of them. And then of the ones we contact, there's another factor, which is the cooperation rate. So we contact them, but they may not agree to participate. So let's say 70% agree to the interview. That would be a cooperation rate, which is a pretty good cooperation rate, but we have to combine it with the contact rate. So you really put those two together. The contact, if we contact 50% and we only contact 50% and 70% agree to participate, that means really we only have 35% of the originally selected organizations, or only 35, let's say, of the original 100 organizations that we would end up having data on. So those two things together represent the response rate. So, and then we have to ask the question, well, does non-response cause bias? Is it possible that the 35 organizations that we were able to contact and who were willing to participate, are they potentially different than other nonprofit organizations that we weren't able to contact and weren't willing to participate? So let's say, for example, okay, now let me just review the example in the book we give about non-response bias influencing the results. And I think this example is good because it's intuitive, and I think you can get the sense of how this kind of non-response would be bias, which is, so suppose we're doing a telephone survey, and this was actually, we give the example of a study that was actually done in California about recycling. And let's say we, begin the survey by saying, hello, we're taking a poll this evening about recycling. Can I get started? It'll just take 5 minutes of your time. We'll ask a few questions. Now, it could be that people who are already recycling, who are interested in recycling, who care about recycling, they're more willing to participate. And those who don't recycle and don't care about recycling, they may be embarrassed or uninterested or even hostile to the topic of the survey. So that would be a case in which the propensity to respond might be directly related to the thing we're trying to measure in the survey, which is the recycling behavior. So this is what this diagram shows. It's a causal diagram, kind of like our path models, but it shows that the very behavior we're trying to measure, recycling, may be a cause of people's willingness to respond or their propensity to respond to the poll. And if that's true, then our estimate, let's say, we might say 70% of the people in the state of California recycle, that may be biased, and biased in a particular way. It may be an overestimate of the rate of recycling because people who are enthusiastic and engaged in recycling already were more likely to respond to the poll. People who were hostile or apathetic about recycling were less likely to respond to the poll. So the propensity to respond is directly related to the thing that the survey is trying to measure. Now, this is just one example. The propensity to respond may not be always related to what the poll is trying to measure. So it could be that non-response has a big effect on the results of the survey, but it can also be that non-response is sort of ignorable, that it may be sort of independent of the variables that the survey is seeking to measure. So we discuss more of those variations in the book, but I just wanted to give you a sense of both the general issue of non-response, which is it's increasingly a problem in a lot of research these days. I mean, some telephone surveys nowadays have response rates that are under 20%, sometimes even around 10%. And internet surveys typically have response rates of around 10%, and mail surveys also have response rates that are in the low tens, 30% rate of response. And so it's a major issue in most forms of survey research and data collection in a lot of policy areas. So, but again, the bias that comes from it depends to some extent on why people are not responding. And it can be more or less severe bias depending on that. So now I'd like to just say a few words about non-probability sampling, because this is it's a form of sampling that is used a lot in many kinds of research, but it particularly brings out these questions of response bias, because there's a kind of it can be even more exaggerated in this kind of sampling. Two most two broad forms of non-probability sampling are voluntary sampling, which is just calling for volunteers or putting out an ad for volunteers to participate in a study. And this is increasingly done on the internet now, where ads are put on Facebook or Google ads to kind of recruit people into studies. And then there's convenience sampling, which may be often done in clinical research or academic studies, where people or elements in the study are chosen because they're conveniently available, like students on a campus or patients in a hospital where the researchers are working. So both forms of sampling bring up the issues of coverage bias and response bias that we talked about earlier. And in addition to those forms of sampling, other kinds of non-probability sampling are snowball sampling, which is sometimes referred to as chain sampling. It's basically recruiting a few people and then asking them to refer the researcher to other people who are then referred, and then who refer the researcher on to other people. So it's a kind of sampling by reputation or by referral. Sometimes researchers use something called quota sampling, which is when you try to target a certain number of people or groups that meet certain characteristics into your study. Let's say you want an even number of males and females, or older and younger people. You may sort of divide your population into groups and then sample to fill those quotas. And then in online research, there's a kind of voluntary sampling that's used increasingly, where people are recruited broadly to be in internet access panels. It's a form of a kind of a population of people that are pre-recruited to participate in various kinds of online research.